Welcome, everybody. It's a really good to talk with you. I'm Dan Drost, the vegetable specialist, but one of the things that I've been interested in and working on for the last about 20 years here at the university is working with cover crops and focusing on how they can improve our soils. And so I'm going to feature that as a soil improving component that we're going to talk about today and give you some insights as to how you should integrate them into your small farm. Okay. Oops, let's go back. So basically cover crops are here to do a couple things for us. First, they're there to kind of trap or cycle nutrients, and they in turn then are going to feed the crops that we're interested in. So here we have some cover crops that were grown before these various vegetables, and we want to look at how that might impact them in some way. Another thing that cover crops can do for us is that enhances soil health also is it can just stabilize the soil. Now, most of us here are growing on kind of flat soil, so erosion from water may be a problem if you're on a slope type soil. But sometimes in the spring we get high winds, and we all can in the West understand how those winds can move soil, and we can see it in the air. And so just stabilizing that soil and keeping it in place is important for us. And certainly having something on the soil over the winter can be really useful to us to help hold it in place. Another thing that can actually help soils is to just try and suppress the weeds that are there, because the weeds then interfere with some of the other things that we want to do. And if we're not careful with weed growth, in some ways we could think of weed as a cover crop in its own right, but if it goes to seed, then it becomes a real problem for us to contend with. And we have to be, focusing our attentions on ways that we can manage weeds that maybe at times take us away from the use of some kind of chemical that would suppress that weed, and we can use a cover crop to do that. And the last thing we're going to look at is a little bit about, thinking about biological activity. And essentially that has to do with, those microbes that are there that are going to give us some responses. And so we need to be thinking about where they come into our farm operation. And we can think of using cover crops as a place for the autumn time or the fall of the year, where it's going to stabilize that soil over our winter periods. Or we may be using it sometime during the summer when we have an open section in the garden or in the small farm that needs to have some protection and try to suppress those. And essentially, when we look at cover crops, we have three different types that we're going to focus on. We have things that we call grasses. We have things that are broadleaf in nature, or in things that are legumes, and we're going to focus our attention on those. So let's look first at the grass cover crops. And I've got three slides that look like this. The slides basically have a species of plant on the left-hand side, a timing when we would put that plant into use, how much production of dry matter that plant will produce, and then what that plant can do for us. Does it trap nutrients? Does it enhance the soil? Does it fight erosion? Does it keep weeds in check? And then the last two are, does it grow rapidly and does it last? And those are important for us to understand, because what we're really interested in is things that do that. And some of the cover crops that I want you to think about doing and using in the grass family are things like millet, wheat, or sorghum. And the reason for those are they are ones that we have tested and compared to these other species, and we find that they tend to do the best in terms of timing. So millet in the summer, it grows really fast. It produces a reasonable amount of biomass. It does a really nice job. The bigger the number, those numbers in the circles just means that it traps those components more effectively than other cover crops. And we can see that all of the grass type cover crops do that very well. Sorghum is another nice one. It grows really big. It likes really hot conditions, and is really, really good at kind of putting things in place. In the fall of the year, we might want to use something like wheat or barley or rye. A lot of growers and gardeners don't like rye because sometimes it's hard to kill it. And you have to be thinking about how you're going to manage that crop before the next crop comes into play. The next ones are broadleaf cover crops. And the broadleaves, the two that I really like are, for the summer, it would be buckwheat. It really produces a lot of dry matter, but it doesn't really provide too much nutrient back into the system. But it does trap it. It does enhance the soil, and it does a really, really nice job of controlling weeds. And then radishes, or some of the other brassicas. We've been also using kale, those types of things. They're really good because they produce a deep taproot. They can help break up the soil. That means it's a soil enhancer. They produce a nice amount of residue so that they fight erosion, and they do a pretty good job at controlling weeds. So we've got these two that I'm interested in, one summer and one fall type planting crop. And then we've got our legumes. Most people know about legumes. They're nitrogen fixing. And so if we look at that N pounds per acre that they put into place, they all can put a tremendous amount of nutrient back into our soil. They can then supply that nutrient to the crop that we're interested in later on, whether that be a cool season vegetable or a warm season vegetable that we're trying to grow. And so the cover crop is going to give us some of those types of things. And the two that I'm particularly excited about in the fall, we like vetch. That one does by far. It grows vigorously. It produces a tremendous amount of biomass, produces a lot of nitrogen. It doesn't necessarily mop up other nutrients very well, but it does build the soil quite well. And then it does kind of average on some of those other parameters that we're particularly interested in, whether it's erosion fighting or weed checking. And then in the summer, I like to use one of our bean crops. And you might think of your crop as a cover crop in many ways too. If we grow it effectively, we grow it at a reasonably high density, what we can do is use a crop almost as a cover crop to help stabilize that soil. But if we need to add extra nutrient in, I really like one of the beans, and there's many different types that you should be using with those. One key thing to remember if we're using legumes in our small farm areas is make sure that they get inoculated. And you usually only need to do that the first time you put the cover crop down, the legume cover crop in place, is get some inoculum. That rhizobium then ensures that the bacteria colonizes the root system of the plant, and that then helps you with that nitrogen production, because that's what it's really doing. The other one is there are a couple perennials that people use. People talk about clover. If you read information from the eastern half of the United States, a lot of growers out there use clovers, but you got to be careful. We did a study once with white clover, and it became a perennial nightmare for us on our small farm operations. And therefore, it's certainly not one that we recommend, even though clovers can maybe have a place if we can terminate them. And that's what we have to think about with anything that has this perennial nature to it. Alfalfa, people talk about, well, maybe that's not going to fit into our farm operation. A bigger farmer might use alfalfa as a rotational crop, but that persistence and then ultimately how we get rid of it. So when we're thinking about these nutrient cycles, we have to think about the fall, where we're going to try and stabilize that soil over it. And three that we really like to use are vetch, wheat, and then either kale or radish, depending on what our soil conditions might be like. And sometimes we're going to use these by themselves, and there'll be opportunities for us to mix those so that we might use a vetch wheat combination to be able to trap nutrients, because the grass will trap nutrients more effectively than the vetch will, but the vetch will produce nitrogen that the wheat maybe doesn't do. And so we need to be thinking about how we're going to do that. And then on your farm, the big issue is, how does that fit or tie into what I'm trying to accomplish as a producer? How do I work that into my system, and can I grow it to get enough biomass to stabilize that soil and get itself established? And then in the summer, we have kind of the same type of issues. We might use some beans, or we might use some millet or sorghum. We might put in some buckwheat. We might mix these things together, and that helps us to recycle nutrients that were there from the springtime crop that we maybe had, some early lettuce or early brassicas or something. And yet at the same time, that cover crop needs to be pretty fast. It needs to grow quickly. It needs to fill in the space in a short period of time. And the net effect of that would be that I can then kind of integrate it into my system. So let's look at nutrient management just a little bit more closely. And there's a couple more publications that we have listed here. And as Dr. Black said in our previous conversation, if you go to the USU Extension website, and then that's under extension.usu.edu, and then in there, you search for cover crops, you're going to come up with maybe 12 or 14 publications that deal with cover crops in a wide variety of different situations. And two that I'm just highlighting here are one that cover crops for vegetables, and then cover cropping for organic vegetable production, which is thinking about how cover crops are involved in the nutrient strategies that I'm going to look at. So the key thing with cover crops is the selection process. You need to be able to establish them, they need to grow quickly, and they need to be adapted to your particular environment. And so if we're in southern Utah where it's a lot hotter, we're going to have to think, oh, when do I put them in the ground? They're maybe different than what we would do here if we were in northern Utah. And do I have the resources to grow them? One of the things that we've noted lately is we like to start establishing cover crops here in northern Utah in early September to late September. But sometimes September is really dry, and I don't have the irrigation or the water to be able to get this crop established. And we had some of that last fall. It was an extremely dry September, and without irrigation, we wouldn't have been able to get our cover crops established. And then this integration into your farm becomes important. Does it fit? Our farms are important to us. I have to grow the crop that I'm trying to sell. So if I'm trying to grow berries, or if I'm trying to grow tomatoes, those are crops that start early, they end late. And how do I integrate a cover crop in there are some of the things that we need to think about. So here's a strategy that we use on our student farm up in Logan. And what the student farm does is it integrates cover crops planted in the fall of the year, starting in September, growing through to the next cycle, and then we terminate that about 2 weeks before we're going to plant our cool season vegetables. And here in northern Utah, we usually start planting these cool season crops like broccoli and lettuce and carrots and those types of things in early May. So that means I've got some growth in the fall, I've got a little bit more growth in the spring, but not maybe enough biomass to completely get me through that crop. And then I'm growing cool season crops all the way through, so that in the fall, I need to use another cover crop in place of that. And so what the approach that the student farm does is it farms half of its land each year with vegetables, cool season or warm season, and the other half is growing cover crops. And that is a strategy that has worked okay on it. Now, if you were trying to do that on a whole farm, I need to crop all of my land because I need to make the income necessary to make that work. Then I've got to be thinking about what cover crops am I planting in September? What cool season vegetables do I terminate so that I can grow that hairy vetch and winter wheat cover crop here? If I'm doing warm season, how do I do that? And so this one publication strategizes on how you can effectively accomplish those things. So that's some nutrient tips. So what about soil stability? Well, there's a number of ways that farmers are using it. One of the approaches is they use a no-till system or they use a strip system. The no-till system essentially says everything is covered with cover crop, and then somehow I terminate the growth of that cover crop, I kill it somehow, and then I plant my tomatoes, in this case, back into it. And so in Michigan, we did a lot of that type of work before I moved to Utah. We grew these cover crops of various forms, and then we had to figure out a way to get them out of place and kill them so that I could get my tomato crop in, and that stabilized the soil so that any runoff off that hill during a rainstorm didn't bring soil from up at the top of the hill down to the bottom. Here in Utah, farmers asked me, well, could I do something similar, but I'm using plastic? So I suggested, because of our strong winds, use the cover crop as a windbreak, irrigate it maybe to get it up and grow through the winter. And then in the summer, when you're growing your crop, when it's dry, the cover crop doesn't get any irrigation, it dies out, but it stands there and becomes a nice windbreak for the particular crop. And it helps suppress the weeds in that area. Whereas between the rows, you can see these weeds are growing that the farmer says he has to contend with. And many of our larger scale growers are using that approach, which would work really quite nicely, particularly if you have some wind problems or if you have some soil crusting problems. That cover crop can add some stability to it. Cover crops do other things for our soils as well. And one of those things that we need to be thinking about is, how do I get water into my soil? What happens is we till it regularly, we work it, and we create these compacted zones. And so these radishes and some of those other vegetables or other cover crops will grow roots deep down into the profile. And then as the cover crop dies, you have a channel where water can no longer just puddle on the surface. It can now penetrate the soil. And that breakage is important to us. The other thing it does is it helps reduce compaction. So you can drive equipment on it, or you can walk on it more effectively, and you'll not create that compact zone. Cover crops also create places for insects to hide, and those insects are beneficials that can attack some of the problem insects that we have in our vegetable operations, and those hiding sites are important. Plus, they also supply food and nectar and those types of things that can help beneficials survive. And then some of these cover crops will produce compounds that suppress either weeds or other insects. And weeds probably are our biggest problem. We have to be thinking about them because they have an impact on our soil. So we need to be able to say, when is my problem? And does a fall cover crop or does a summer cover crop give me more options for managing those weeds? And in particular, in an organic system, how do I deal with perennial weeds? Things like bindweed, some of the grasses. How do I get them out of my system, and how can I manage those in a more effective way? And here we can see a couple of examples. In the back, we have some vetch back here that was growing as one of our cover crops, and our vegetables grow more vigorously, and they tend to shade out the weeds that might be in place. Wheat produces an awful lot of biomass, and we can see in this section where the wheat was, we have very few weeds that are growing in there, and one or two cultivations can effectively control them. But where we were producing kale, using kale as a cover crop, now some of those weeds are coming into place, and some of them become problem weeds because we were getting more perennial weeds, and that is a problem that we have to deal with. And if we look at them in the fall of the year, when we're establishing these winter type vegetables, we can see some of that effect. Here, kale, which we establish, or some years we use radish, it happens earlier in the year to get some biomass, and the kale now occupies all of the space, and we get almost no weeds growing in that system. Whereas winter wheat or hairy vetch, which we establish later, we can see the wheat is growing here, but we have some of these fall annual weeds that are kind of also in the system, and we need to be kind of dealing with that as we're thinking about how we're going to manage them in the next year. And then when I till those cover crops into my crop, here is vetch in the foreground, here is wheat, where this young lady in the red is, and kale is way in the back there. You can't see it very well, but look at how much biomass has been produced by the vetch and the wheat in April. And the net effect of that is we see almost no winter annual weeds coming into place. And now we can plant that vegetable crop of interest, in this case, broccoli, back into that system and get the benefits of those. Now, cover crops and vegetables do have an impact on the crop that follows. So here's a case we're going to show you about crops and the replant. So here in this section, we grew beans through this strip. Here we grew some sweet corn. Over here, we were growing broccoli. And we can see that sweet corn, with all the biomass and the nutrients that it takes, does suppress the cover crop that we're trying to establish in the fall, whereas beans doesn't have any impact. And much of that has to do with how rapidly that cover crop broke down. We can still see residue here of the corn stalks, and that is then suppressing the crop that we're interested in. And if we looked at them closely in the box here, and in our research, we've counted the plants and measured them. We have no difference in plant stands. It's just that the plant is not able to get the nutrients it needs from that residue of the vegetable to grow, whereas in the bean or in the broccoli situation, it does better. If we look at a summer cover crop and how that translates into productivity in the fall for the next crop that we're interested in growing, we can see that if we had a summer buckwheat crop or a summer millet or a summer black bean, and then we're growing kale in this case, or wheat in the backdrop, it has no effect on stands and no effect on plant growth. And so strategizing about how we're going to think about integrating different crops into our situation becomes really important for us as we're working our way through the system. So in summary, think about the adaptation of those. Where are places in your farm that would benefit from them? Which ones do you need to deal with? Do you need to be working on nutrients, or do you need to be working on weeds, or do you need to find protection for those plants? And then do that. And then go to the extension.usu website to look at what's done locally, or better yet, another resource that you want. This book right here called Managing Cover Crops Profitably is available for free. It's free from Western Sayer. You can go there and download that book to your tablet or computer and then use it. If you want to purchase it, it'll cost you like $25 plus shipping, but you can get it for free. And this one has so many resources in it, and it's one that I highly recommend for giving you options, suggestions, and it talks about a lot more cover crops than I was able to cover in this conversation. So with that, I'm going to finish my talk here and address any questions that may arise. So Sheridan, are there any questions for me?
There are a lot of questions for you.
Yikes.
All right, so preparing the soil in the spring for a cover crop, do you have to turn in the cover crop? What if you don't want too much nitrogen in your soil? Is that an issue with cover crops?
No, it isn't, because you can think of the cover crop in two ways. If you if you incorporate it and it breaks down, then the nutrients that are trapped there will be expended back to the crop that you're interested in. Or you could leave that cover crop on the surface, and then it acts like a surface mulch, but it holds water better. It keeps the soil a little bit cooler, and it doesn't break down, because you know that in our dry climate here, it suddenly will look like hay out in the field, a hay field. And so that may work for you on your farm. And then again, it may not. And so you have to kind of ask yourselves, what issues are important to me?
Perfect. Thank you. So you've talked a little bit about, the cover crops and minimizing weed potential. We have a couple questions about annual versus perennial weeds and what the difference is there. And then using cover crops between rows that are growing, like a cash crop. How would you incorporate that?
Yeah, so the annual weeds are ones that come up each year, they flower and they produce seed, and that goes back into the soil. So the first thing is, never let the seeds go back into the soil. So never let them flower, and that helps with weeds. But perennials, like some of our grasses, like bindweed, those become more challenging, and many of our cover crops won't control those. Now, as for integrating them between rows, yes, you can do that, but have to remember that if your cover crop is extremely vigorous and gets very tall, Sudan grass will grow 4 or 5 feet tall, it will outcompete your crop of interest. And so you need a smaller, shallower, shorter statured one. And you may need to do something to kind of suppress its growth, because it's going to take nutrients and water, and those are our 2 limiting resources in many of our farm operations.
Wonderful, thank you. Is there a reason that you like beans over cowpeas?
No, I've had both, but I find that the beans grow faster. They establish more quickly. They fill in more tightly than cowpea does. Cowpea gets quite tall. And so I really, really like, in our short growing season where I need to grow a cover crop for a really short period of time, the bean does a much, much better job of kind of integrating into that system, so that I can then come back in with a fall crop or a fall cover crop if I need to carry on.
Perfect. Let's see. Can you talk about when you would plant a summer cover crop in order to get rid of it by mid-September? What would your timing look like?
Well, our timing is usually we're trying to put in that summer cover crop somewhere in mid to late June. It could be as late as mid to late July. You just don't grow as much biomass. It kind of depends on what you're putting it after. So if you have a very early crop of vegetables that you're growing, and then that ground's going to be open, and then I'm going to maybe come in with some late lettuce in the fall or something like that, and I want something in the middle so that that ground doesn't grow weeds, I'm going to just integrate a cover crop into that short area. And that one on nutrient management for organic farms, that one details a lot of information about that one. So get that one, and it tells you more about how to figure out those timings, because it all has to do with timing. If you're in the South and you have a long growing season, I've got more time to do things. If you're in a short growing area, let's say I'm up in the Heber Valley or someplace like that, a summer cover crop may never even work in your system because you just don't have time to do it.
Perfect. I know that there are a lot more questions, and we just don't have time to get to all of them.
I see about 1 minute, so one more.
Okay, one more. Yeah. Let's see. Are there any crops that you cannot plant in the cover crop residue if you're not tilling?
No, I think all of them work pretty good. The only one that I'm a little bit leery about, that I have a lot of experience, is with rye. Rye produces some chemicals that are really suppressive to other plants. And so I don't recommend rye. Wheat works much, much better for the fall and doesn't have that problem. And millet works really nice in the summer, and it doesn't have that problem. And they both, are really fast and establish quickly and grow quite nicely under those summer or fall conditions.
Perfect.
And the other questions that I see our audience has put forward, I will go into the question and answer and start working through them. So, you know, Rhonda or John or whoever, you know, that has asked a question about that and haven't been able to get an answer, we'll cover there. So with that, I'm going to